Society has a name for people who go quiet without warning. Actually, it has several, and none of them are kind. Difficult, cold, avoidant. They ghosted. Can't handle relationships. Doesn't know how to communicate. Something happened to them and they never dealt with it properly. These words spread fast. They get used with a lot of confidence by people who watched someone pull back, who saw a friendship quietly disappear, who noticed that a family member stopped picking up the phone, and who reached almost immediately for the simplest explanation available. And the simplest explanation is almost always the same. Something is wrong with that person. Not something complicated, not something worth investigating. Just a convenient label that lets everyone else off the hook and wraps the whole situation in a tidy little narrative. They had a problem. They couldn't handle it. They left. End of story. But that explanation has a massive blind spot. One that almost nobody talks about. Because before those people went quiet, most of them were something that nobody remembers to mention when the labels start flying. Before the silence, before the distance, before the unanswered messages and the calls that stopped coming, most of those people were the exact opposite of what their reputation eventually became. They were the ones who answered, not occasionally, not when it was easy or convenient, or when they happened to be free. They answered when none of those things were true. They answered at 11 at night when someone had a crisis. They answered on days when they themselves were running on nothing. When they had problems nobody knew about, when they had already given more than they had to give and still managed to pick up because not picking up felt like a moral failure they couldn't live with. They were the ones who stayed, who showed up, who mediated the arguments that would have destroyed friendships if someone hadn't stepped in, who softened the edges of conversations that were about to go somewhere irreparable, who remembered the birthdays, the anniversaries, the details that other people forgot because they were paying attention, who held the weight of other people's stories in their own minds, long after those people had moved on and forgotten they'd even shared them. They were the person that people called when things were bad, and they answered, almost always. And then one day they stopped, not because of a dramatic final argument, not because of one specific conversation that crossed a line and made everything clear. Not because of a confrontation that got out of hand and left everyone knowing exactly where they stood. Because something much quieter than that happened. Something that accumulated slowly, over months or years, in a way that didn't announce itself clearly until it was already too late to pretend it wasn't real. Something that gathered in the space between all those answered calls, all those late nights, all those moments of giving without being asked if they had anything left to give. And that is the part of the story that nobody asks about. That is the part that gets skipped entirely when the labels come out. We have built a world where being constantly available has been quietly elevated to a kind of moral standard. Not just an expectation, a form of proof, evidence of your character, evidence that you actually care about the people in your life, that you're a good friend, a good partner, a good son or daughter or sibling or colleague, a good human being. The logic runs like this. If you truly care about someone, you respond when they reach out. You show up when they need you. You make yourself accessible. You stay present. And if you pull back, if you go quiet, if you stop showing up in the ways that people had come to expect, then regardless of what you intended or what was actually happening inside you, what you communicated is simple. You don't care. That logic sounds reasonable at first. It even sounds generous, because it treats responsiveness as a form of love, and in some ways it is. But it contains a flaw that almost nobody stops to examine. It treats emotional energy as though it's infinite. It builds entire relationship structures on the assumption that a person can keep giving, keep absorbing, keep being present and responsive and available indefinitely, without that sustained output having any consequence on the person doing the giving. It never asks what the constant availability is actually costing. And for some people, the answer to that unasked question was everything. The neuroscientist and psychiatrist Stephen Porges spent decades researching something he called the polyvagal theory. It's a framework for understanding how the human nervous system actually functions in social environments, how it decides below the level of conscious thought whether a situation is safe or threatening, whether to open up or pull back. whether to stay connected or conserve. What Porges found, at its core, is something that most people will recognize the moment they hear it. The nervous system doesn't operate in a single fixed state. It operates in different physiological modes, and it shifts between those modes automatically, based on information it's constantly processing from the environment. Not information you consciously evaluate. Information the body detects before the thinking mind gets involved. When a person is in an environment that feels genuinely safe, when the social cues around them are predictable and trustworthy, when there's no underlying sense of threat, the nervous system settles into what Porges describes as a state that supports social engagement. In this state, the body is calm. The mind is open. You can listen without defensiveness. You can give without it feeling like extraction. You can be fully present for another person, and that presence doesn't hollow you out. This is the state where real connection happens, where relationships actually nourish both people, where giving and receiving flow in a way that feels sustainable, because in that state, it genuinely is. But the nervous system also has other modes, and one of them gets activated when the body detects something different. Not necessarily a physical threat. The nervous system is not limited to responding to things like danger or violence. It also responds to patterns, to sustained emotional depletion, to the chronic experience of giving at a rate that exceeds recovery, to relationships that consistently ask for more than they return. When the system detects that pattern, it shifts. Not because you decide to shift, not because you think it through and conclude that a change is needed. The shift happens automatically, below the level of conscious choice, as a biological response to information the body has been collecting for a long time. It starts conserving resources. It starts reducing exposure. It starts creating distance. And the critical thing to understand about that response is this: it is not a flaw. It is not evidence of emotional immaturity or psychological damage or an inability to form healthy attachments. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do when it detects that the current mode of operation is no longer sustainable. Protect the system. Pull back. Recover. The withdrawal doesn't feel like a decision because, in the deepest sense, it isn't one. It's biology. It's the body making a call that the conscious mind was too trained to argue against to make on its own. Now here is where this gets considerably more complex. For many of the people who eventually go quiet, this wasn't a pattern the nervous system developed in adulthood. It wasn't something that emerged in response to one particularly draining friendship or one relationship that went wrong. The nervous system learned this strategy much earlier, in environments where closeness wasn't always safe, where emotional intimacy carried an unpredictable cost, where being too present, too available, too visible could lead somewhere uncomfortable and sometimes somewhere worse. Murray Bowen was a psychiatrist who spent the better part of his career studying how emotional patterns move through families across generations. He was one of the founders of what eventually became family systems therapy, and one of the concepts he identified and named is something he called emotional cutoff. Emotional cutoff is not simply about people who stop talking to their families, though it can look like that on the surface. It's about something more fundamental. It's about the adaptive strategy that people develop when they learn, usually early in life, that closeness and safety don't always come together. That getting close to someone doesn't automatically mean you're protected. That sometimes the people who were supposed to be safe were the ones who weren't. Children who grow up in environments like that learn to read the emotional temperature of every room they enter. They develop a kind of internal weather radar that tells them, before they've consciously processed anything, whether it's a good moment to be present or a wiser moment to disappear, whether to speak or stay silent, whether to ask for something or swallow the need and wait. These children become remarkably good at detecting subtle shifts in tone, in energy, in the way someone holds their body or changes the subject, or doesn't quite look you in the eyes when they say everything is fine. They learn to catch things that most people miss entirely, because for them, catching those things early was never just a social skill. It was a form of survival. And the adaptation they build, this capacity to manage distance as a form of self-protection, doesn't stay behind when they grow up. It travels with them. It becomes part of how they read relationships, part of how they assess situations, part of how they decide, often without fully knowing why. Whether something feels safe or whether the instinct to withdraw is quietly starting to speak. When a relationship in their adult life starts to activate the same signals that were present in those early environments, the nervous system doesn't schedule a meeting to deliberate. It doesn't wait for enough evidence to build a rational case. It starts doing what it learned to do. It starts pulling back, and that is the internal experience that nobody asks about when the labels get applied. Because from the outside, silence looks deliberate. It looks like a choice. It looks like someone decided to check out, decided to stop caring, decided they were done and couldn't be bothered to have the conversation that would have at least given the other person some kind of explanation. From the outside, the story is almost always some version of, they took the easy way. But from the inside, the experience is almost nothing like that. From the inside, there is exhaustion, not the ordinary kind that sleep fixes. The particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained emotional labor, from the long-term effort of being present for people who weren't tracking whether you had anything left. From the experience of giving something that doesn't replenish itself at the rate it's being drawn from. From the inside, there is an awareness, sometimes fully articulated, and sometimes just a dull weight that's been there for years, that this relationship has been operating at a deficit for a long time. That something leaves every time there's contact. That after spending time with this person, or after reading their messages, or after having the same conversation for the 15th time with the same outcome, something in you is smaller than it was before. And when that awareness reaches a certain threshold, when the gap between what the relationship extracts and what it returns becomes wide enough that no amount of goodwill can bridge it, the withdrawal doesn't feel like abandonment. It feels like oxygen. Not relief in the triumphant sense, not the satisfaction of having won something, just the quiet bodily sensation of something that was pressing against you finally, and for the first time in what might be years, letting go. There is a conversation about loneliness that tends to surface whenever this topic gets discussed. It's worth having directly because it's frequently used to argue that withdrawal is always a mistake. The research on social isolation is real and it is serious. We know that chronic loneliness has measurable physiological consequences. It raises cortisol, which over time suppresses immune function and accelerates inflammatory processes. It has been linked to increased risk of cardiovascular disease, earlier cognitive decline, shorter life expectancy. The research is not ambiguous on this. Sustained isolation from meaningful human connection carries real costs to the body, not just to the mood. These findings get cited regularly to make a case that people should stay connected, that pulling back from relationships is fundamentally self-destructive, that the instinct to withdraw is always, in some sense, the wrong instinct. But there is something that same body of research documents just as clearly, something that tends to get left out of the popular version of that argument. The quality of the connection is what matters. Not the presence of connection in the abstract, not the simple fact of having people around, not the number of contacts in your phone, or the frequency of messages exchanged, or the regularity of social appearances. The actual quality of the connection, and what it does to the nervous system of the person inside it. Being surrounded by people in relationships that don't feel safe, that operate on the basis of conditional acceptance, that require constant monitoring of what you say and how you say it and how much of yourself you reveal, keeps the nervous system in a state of chronic low-grade activation. It elevates cortisol. It suppresses immune function. It prevents the kind of genuine recovery and regulation that real social safety is supposed to provide. The research does not actually support the idea that any connection is better than no connection. What it supports, when you look at it carefully, is something far more specific. Relationships where you feel genuinely seen. Relationships where support is real rather than performative. Relationships where your presence is valued rather than merely utilized. Those relationships are protective. Those relationships support health and longevity and well-being in ways that are measurable and significant. The absence of that quality is what causes harm. not the absence of company. And this completely changes the question. The question is not whether you should have people in your life. That answer is almost always yes. The question is who those people actually are, and what your presence in their life is actually doing to you over time. The people who end up going quiet have often become very precise at answering that question, not through conscious analysis, through accumulated pattern recognition. They recognize the person who appears when they need something and becomes genuinely difficult to reach when you do, who has an uncanny ability to be unavailable at exactly the moments when unavailability costs you the most, and who becomes remarkably accessible the moment the favor direction reverses. They recognize the family member whose affection comes assembled with small acts of criticism, so regular and so normalized that they no longer register as criticism. They're just part of how that person expresses care, or what passes for care. The comment about your choices, the tone that implies a judgment without stating one. The comparison to someone who did it differently and it's left unspoken but thoroughly communicated better. All delivered with warmth, with a hug, with genuine concern in the voice, which makes it harder to name and harder to push back against, which might be the whole point. They recognize the person who enters at high intensity, who makes you feel, briefly and convincingly, like you are the most interesting and important thing in their world, and then disappears, and comes back, and disappears again, and comes back again, each time with just enough warmth and attention to reset the cycle. Whose presence is simultaneously too much and not enough, whose inconsistency somehow makes you work harder to earn the consistency, which is, when you step back far enough to see it clearly, exactly what it was designed to do. They have seen these patterns enough times, in enough different people, and enough different forms, that they have stopped needing to analyze them in real time. The body registers them first. The slight tightening in the chest before you answer a call. The low-grade dread that attaches to certain names on the screen. The way a conversation with one person leaves you lighter, and a conversation with another leaves you needing to sit quietly for an hour before you feel like yourself again. The body keeps score before the mind has finished forming the argument. And when the body's assessment becomes impossible to override, the withdrawal begins. At which point, the people watching from outside tend to reach their conclusion. They couldn't handle conflict. They lacked the emotional maturity to say what they were feeling. They chose avoidance over honesty. But consider the actual contradiction embedded in that judgment. If these people were genuinely unable to handle difficulty, unable to tolerate discomfort, unable to stay present when things got hard, then why were they the ones who stayed the longest? Why were they the ones absorbing the most, managing the most, making themselves available in exactly the circumstances where the so-called emotionally mature option would have been to say no, or to have the conversation, or to set a limit? Why were they the ones who actually did stay? The truth is that most of the people who eventually go quiet without explanation are not people who avoided difficult conversations. They are people who had them, who pointed to the pattern, named what they were experiencing, asked clearly for something to be different, who hoped, maybe several times, maybe across years, that this time the change would stick, who eventually learned that naming the pattern, explaining the impact, asking for something different, doesn't fix something that the other person isn't actually willing to examine. The silence isn't avoidance. It's what remains when all the other options have been used up. The Harvard study of adult development has been running since 1938. It's one of the most extensive longitudinal studies on human well-being ever completed. Over 80 years, hundreds of participants, entire lifespans tracked and documented across multiple generations of the same families. And the central finding, the one that has held consistently across all of that time and all of that data, is not about money or career success or physical fitness or achievement of any kind. It's about the quality of close relationships. The people who reported the highest levels of sustained well-being, who lived longer, who maintained cognitive function further into old age, who described their lives as meaningful rather than merely busy, were not the people with the largest social circles. They were the people with relationships where they felt genuinely known, where they didn't have to manage how they were perceived to feel safe, where support, when things got difficult, was actually there. Not the appearance of support, not the social performance of support. Support that was actually, concretely, reliably present when needed. The study found repeatedly that a small number of relationships with that quality does more for a person's long-term health and well-being than a large number of relationships without it. Which means that if your social world is contracted, if your circle is smaller than it used to be, if the list of people you genuinely trust has gotten shorter over the years, that is not automatically evidence that something has gone wrong. Depending on why it happened and what replaced what was lost, it might be evidence that something finally went right. There is something honest worth saying here, though, because this conversation is incomplete without it. There is a real difference between withdrawing in order to protect something genuine in yourself, and withdrawing because proximity to other people always carries risk, and you have decided that the risk is never worth taking, between creating distance from relationships that were genuinely and consistently harmful, and using distance as a standing policy against any situation that might require you to be vulnerable or uncertain or possibly hurt. That distinction matters. The adaptive strategy built in childhood, the one that learned to use distance as protection, is not precise. It doesn't always accurately distinguish between environments that were truly unsafe and environments that are simply challenging in the ordinary and often necessary ways that close relationships always are. Sometimes it fires when it shouldn't. Sometimes the door it closes was a door that led somewhere real. That is not an accusation. It is simply worth knowing, worth asking yourself with genuine honesty rather than as a way of talking yourself back into something harmful. Is the distance you've built protecting you? Or has it become a default setting that doesn't fully distinguish between what's worth keeping out and what deserves more consideration than you're currently giving it? That's a question only you can answer from the inside. For the people whose silence came from a clear and honest place, for the people who gave too much for too long to relationships that were genuinely taking more than they returned. For the people who were labeled cold and difficult and avoidant precisely because they stopped being infinitely available to people who never asked whether they were okay. Here is what actually happened in those situations. You didn't stop caring. You stopped performing care in a way that was consuming your actual capacity to care about anything at all. You didn't abandon anyone. You made room, maybe for the first time in a long time, for the possibility that there were people somewhere whose presence wouldn't require you to be constantly depleted. You didn't withdraw from connection. You stopped accepting the simulation of connection in place of the real thing. And the quiet you found in that process, the space that opened up where the noise had been, was not emptiness. It was the first thing that had felt like genuine rest in longer than you probably want to admit. The question that remains, and it's the one that only you can answer, is this. Is there someone in your current life, or somewhere within reach of it, who is actually worth that space? Not worth the version of you that ran itself into the ground for everyone who asked. The version of you that has learned something. The version of you that understands now what genuine reciprocity feels like when it's real, because you've lived long enough with the version that wasn't. Because if there is, then the quiet doesn't have to be the conclusion. It can be the starting point, the place from which something more honest gets built, and the people who eventually find their way to that, who choose a smaller and more carefully considered version of connection over the wide, loud, exhausting version they used to inhabit, tend to end up with something that all the busyness and availability and constant social motion never quite produced. Something that actually feels like it belongs to them. Something that doesn't ask them to disappear in order to maintain it. That's not isolation. That's not damage. That's not something to be fixed or explained or apologized for. That is what it looks like when someone finally stops giving their presence to people who never noticed the cost of it, and starts giving it instead to the ones who do.